I keep a photograph taped inside my case file. A quiet white house on a quiet Iowa street. Windows blank as if holding their breath. That's your hook. And it's mine too, because once you learn what waited behind those windows on June 10th, 1912, you never look at small-town silence the same way again. 8 people in their beds, the house sealed from the inside by ordinary habit, morning chores left undone like a sentence without a period. Before the town woke, the story had already ended, and for the last century, we've been listening for who wrote it. By 7 me, the neighbor Mary Peckham noticed the break in routine. No milk pail clatter, no children in the yard, no sweep of a broom on the porch. She knocked, found the door locked, freed the chickens, then sent for Josiah Moore's brother, Ross, the only person who might make locked feel normal. Ross came with his key and stepped into the stillness, making it only as far as the first door to the parlor before stepping back out with his face ashen. He told Peckham to summon the marshal, Henry Hank Horton, and with that, Villisca's quiet broke for good. I've read Horton's account so many times it feels like muscle memory. He enters a darkened home that someone tried hard to keep dark. Curtains are drawn or improvised with clothing, mirrors covered, a lamp upstairs set to the faintest wick, its chimney removed so light wouldn't spill. The air holds the metallic damp of washed blood. There's a basin with pink water in the kitchen, and a 4-pound slab of bacon inexplicably pulled from the icebox and left near the guest room. The axe Josiah Moore's own leans where the Stillinger girls lie. Order matters in murder, and the order here suggests patience. Later investigators found 2 cigarette butts in the attic and an imprint in the barn, hay by a knothole, as if someone waited, watched, and counted lights. The family had returned late from a church program, a public schedule that turned private only when the front door clicked. If the killer hid upstairs, he would have heard the house exhale. Footsteps softening, bed springs settling, one lamp, then none. Strategy as lullaby, cruelty paced by the metronome of sleep. I walk the rooms in my head the way Horton walked them in his boots. First the master bedroom, Josiah and Sarah Moore, bludgeoned as they slept. The ceiling above Josiah scarred by the high arc of the first strikes. Then the children's rooms, 4 small bodies tucked into a nightmare that never woke them. Downstairs, the visiting Stillinger sisters Lena and Ina found last, and maybe not first to die, but last to be arranged. The killer covered faces with bedding, a ritual gesture I've come to recognize as either mercy or ownership, depending on the mind that does it. Evidence speaks in fragments. Superstition rushes to make a sentence. The covered mirrors and windows, the dimmed lamp, the water in the basin, the bacon pulled from the icebox, each piece becomes a theory depending on who's telling it. Horton had facts. The town had footprints. Before the house could be sealed, 100 people tramped through. Ghoulish tourism before the word existed, and the scene began to blur at the edges. We still argue over how many clues were genuine and how many were made by curiosity. What we do know feels like the start of a pattern. Sunday night return from church. Midnight strikes. Weapon abandoned at the scene. Rail line close enough to carry a stranger in and out between whistles. In other Midwestern cases from that era, mirrors were covered and lamps dimmed, as if the killer traveled with both ritual and timetable. Was Villisca one point on a jagged line of rail rider murders, or a personal grudge dressed in coincidence? The file never quite decides, and that indecision is its gravity. Suspects arrived like weather. There was the prominent businessman and political rival Frank F. Jones, whose feud with Josiah over hardware trade and sales routes made a neat motive on paper and a messy one in court. There was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher with unnerving habits and a confession that couldn't outlast cross-examination. And there was the Burns Agency's pet theory of a serial axeman riding the rails, with a detective named Wilkerson stitching far-flung cases into a single suit that never fit quite right. Each file promises certainty until you read the next one. I hold on to the small, stubborn artifacts. A fragment of a keychain on the first floor that didn't belong to the family. The gas lamp burning low without its glass. The attic cigarettes. The Barnes knothole vantage. None of these carry a name, but each carries behavior. And behavior is the closest thing we get to a signature. People don't change their steps as easily as they think. If you've used a home's geography like this once, you'll do it again. When I retrace the day before the murders, the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church glows like a lantern for anyone who needed a schedule. Sarah Moore helped coordinate. Each of the Moore children took a turn, and the Stillinger sisters stayed the night on short notice. That's a guest room added after dusk, a decision overheard by anyone lingering near the church steps or the walk home. Opportunity is the quietest suspect. It never needs an alibi because it's in every room. The town's edges matter. Villisca's rail line stitched it to a country on-the-move salesmen, preachers, drifters, and men who could finish a night in one town and greet the morning 2 counties away. A witness in a neighboring city claimed he saw a man boarding a morning train who said he'd walked from Villisca, but payroll logs and distance maps turned that claim into a chess puzzle. One move lights the board, the next throws it back into shadow. With time, even timetables become folklore. You learn to underline only the parts inked by more than one hand. I don't trust the house. I trust the habits. The coverings, the low flame, the washed basin, the arranged bodies, the lingering to eat or pretend to these belong to someone who wanted control more than blood. Control needs darkness, and Victorians kept darkness like a spare key. In my report, I log each ritual as if it were a fingerprint you can't dust, the choreography of a person who rehearsed their fear of being seen. Whoever they were, they staged the house to look back at them without eyes. If you're looking for a twist, it's in the opening moments, not the end. A neighbor's worry, a brother's key, a marshal's cautious steps. That's the point where the story might still have turned, if anyone had known what waited inside. Instead, the town poured through the door, and the case began to run in 2 directions: the careful line of evidence and the stampede of rumor. More than a century later, I walk the careful line and listen to the rumor, and the house stays blank, as if it's still holding its breath for the name we never learned.
But when Horton finally cleared the house, he was careful with his words. "They're all dead," he told Ross Moore, and with that, the rumour mill swallowed Villisca whole. The marshal tried to secure the scene, but within the hour, neighbours, curiosity seekers, and even local businessmen drifted through the rooms, some lifting bedclothes, others pocketing fragments like souvenirs. I picture the blood drying while gossip spread faster than law, the original crime scene dissolving under footsteps before photographs could frame it. I often imagine the first doctor summoned, Dr. Cooper, who examined bodies while townspeople leaned in from the doorway. He would have seen how every blow struck with the blunt end of the axe, the cutting blade used only once to gouge Josiah's face, almost as if to mark him apart from the rest. He might have noted the symmetry of coverings, bedsheets, clothing, curtains all pulled into a single pattern. The house dressed for concealment. It was less an explosion of rage than an arrangement, a tableau built by a mind that wanted to both erase and control. Word reached the sheriff and then the county coroner, and soon reporters from across Iowa descended like flies to a lantern. Photographers set up tripods in the yard. Telegraph lines buzzed with dispatches about the murder house. By sundown, Villisca was a town under siege by its own story, each boarding house and hotel filled with outsiders who wanted to walk past the silent windows and say they'd been there. It became the state's most crowded stage, and the bodies inside were the script everyone believed they could read. The Stillinger family faced a crueler version of grief. They had sent their daughters Lena and Ina for a simple overnight stay. Lena's body, investigators claimed, showed signs she had been awake. Perhaps aware of her fate, perhaps touched inappropriately before death. But in testimony, even that detail bent under doubt. Was it evidence or rumor shaped into evidence? Every uncertainty became another weight, forcing families to carry not just loss but speculation dressed as fact. The grand jury wanted motives, not atmospheres, and motives were easier to find than certainty. Josiah Moore had once worked for Frank Jones's hardware store before splitting off to open his own, even taking the lucrative John Deere account with him. In small towns, commerce is personal, and Jones was no man to forgive an insult. Was this enough to turn rivalry into murder, or just a neat line for the prosecutors, convenient as a headline? Others pointed to the itinerant preacher George Kelly, who had attended the same Children's Day program that night. Kelly was known for his odd behavior watching girls, asking inappropriate questions, drifting between towns with sermons as thin as his alibis. Years later, he confessed, but the confession was riddled with contradictions, and the courts couldn't pin him down. Still, the whisper of his name remains. Like static, you can't tune out when you think of that house. And then came the theory of a broader pattern, an axe murderer crossing state lines on the iron rails. Detectives noted similar killings in Colorado, Kansas, Illinois, families butchered in beds. Lamps dimmed, mirrors covered, doors locked after the deed. Wilkerson of the Burns Agency pursued this path, stitching together a shadow that seemed to ride the trains. But in every case, evidence slipped away. Timetables contradicted one another, and juries preferred names they knew over strangers they couldn't picture. From my desk, a century later, the case reads like two overlapping plays, one of evidence, one of theatre. The evidence is fragile, smudged by the feet of townsfolk and the breath of reporters. The theatre is bold, painted in broad strokes. Jones, the vengeful rival. Kelly, the perverse preacher, the nameless drifter with a timetable of death. And yet the truth hides somewhere in the gap between the two, in the details too quiet to satisfy an audience. I picture Horton writing his report late at night, ink dim under a kerosene lamp, knowing already that what he wrote would never settle the matter. He was a marshal in a town that had outgrown his jurisdiction overnight, a small badge against a storm. Even he could not silence the speculation. The town didn't want silence, it wanted certainty, and certainty was impossible. The house remained white walls staring back at the street, while every theory echoed inside like a voice that never found its owner.
The morning after the discovery, Villisca became a crime scene without borders. Reporters arrived on horseback, in carriages, even on foot, their notebooks eager for a horror that had no owner yet. The house, once a family's shelter, was turned into a macabre museum where whispers replaced prayers. Everyone wanted to see what death looked like when it chose a small town. I walk back into those hours with the case files in hand and try to imagine what Horton felt, standing between civic duty and chaos. He was forced to choose between preserving evidence and calming a town that refused to be calmed. The railroad station buzzed with rumors that the killer had boarded a train while townsfolk tramped over floorboards inside the house. Each step erased more of the truth, until the crime became as much a performance as an investigation. The county coroner, Lindquist, was summoned to take charge. He cataloged the wounds, counted the blows, and ruled the time of death as sometime after midnight. But the autopsy was rushed, done while the house was still swarming, and the precision needed for a capital case was blurred. What remained in the coroner's book were blunt entries, the bare scaffolding of what happened, rather than the full architecture. When I read those notes, I see a killer with intent. Each victim was struck in bed, most while sleeping, but Josiah Moore was singled out for extra violence, his skull reduced to fragments. The Stillinger girls suffered last, suggesting hesitation or a ritualized order. A lamp left dim on the floor of their room cast light, just enough for the killer to see without being seen from outside. It was stagecraft as much as murder. The townspeople demanded answers. Within a week, attention turned toward Frank Jones, the hardware tycoon whose rivalry with Moore was bitter and well known. Jones had lost the John Deere account to Josiah years earlier, and pride often grows sharper than profit. Prosecutors whispered about a hired killer, a contract meant to send a message, but proof is always thinner than theory. In small towns, envy makes its own footprints, even when shoes are absent. Detectives from the Burns Agency scoured the area, following Jones's alleged connections. One name rose often: William Mansfield, a drifter and suspected axeman tied to other crimes. He could have stepped from a train, committed the murders, and vanished before dawn. But no train logs placed him firmly in Villisca, and every witness seemed to point in a different direction. The investigation became a maze with too many exits. Then came Reverend George Kelly. He had preached at the Children's Day program the Moores attended, a night before the murders. Neighbors remembered him wandering the streets, peering into windows, his thin frame jittery with nervous energy. He left town by train early the next morning, a detail that struck many as too convenient. Years later, Kelly confessed after hours of questioning, describing blows and shadows as though he had been there. But the confession was inconsistent, and he soon recanted. The jury saw a fragile man strange, perhaps disturbed, but unreliable as a witness to his own guilt. They acquitted him, leaving the community both relieved and unsatisfied. Theories multiplied faster than evidence. Some said the killer was a stranger riding the rails, part of a string of unsolved axe murders across the Midwest. Others believed it was someone closer, someone whose face the Moors knew and trusted. I look at the case file and see both, an opening made by opportunity and a closing gesture that feels personal. That paradox keeps the pages alive long after the ink has faded. As an officer, I return again and again to the overlooked details. 2 cigarette butts in the attic. Someone waited long enough to smoke, low enough to settle in. A basin of bloody water in the kitchen, as if the killer paused to wash before leaving. The slab of bacon, half-wrapped, left as though forgotten or staged. Each clue is a question, and each question breeds another. What confronts me most is the silence of the children. No one screamed loudly enough to alert neighbors. No one fled. Did the killer move swiftly, methodically, striking before the second victim stirred? Or was there a strange trust, a moment when a familiar silhouette quieted fear until it was too late? Silence can be more telling than noise when you measure it against the walls of a farmhouse. By the time the grand jury convened, Villisca was divided into camps. Some swore Jones orchestrated it. Others insisted Kelly was guilty. Still others saw the hand of a nameless drifter, the same phantom who haunted towns from Illinois to Kansas. No verdict ever satisfied, because each theory explained something but left another piece unexplained. Trials are supposed to sharpen facts, but in Villisca, they only dulled them further. The grand jury called witnesses, weighed testimonies, and considered the rivalries that shadowed Josiah Moore's life. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, George Kelly was tried for the crime after his strange confession was dragged back into the light. The courtroom smelled less of justice than of desperation, a town begging for closure in the shape of a guilty verdict. Kelly's words betrayed him as much as they spared him. He claimed to have heard sounds, seen visions, even touched the axe, but every sentence contradicted the next. The defense painted him as a mentally unstable drifter, too frail and confused to have carried out such violence. Jurors listened, frowned, whispered, then returned with acquittal. What was meant to end suspicion only fed it further, for acquittals leave a ghost in the room that no one can name. Meanwhile, the Jones theory simmered. Private Detective Wilkerson swore that Senator Frank Jones had hired William Blackie Mansfield to eliminate Josiah. Mansfield, after all, was accused of other axe killings, his own family in Illinois, another set of victims in Kansas. The story fit too neatly. A wealthy rival, a hired killer, a weapon close at hand. But the neatness collapsed under scrutiny. No ledger, no contract, no credible witness ever tied them to Villisca. The problem wasn't lack of suspects, it was too many. Each line of inquiry forked into another. Kelly's oddities, Mansfield's alleged pattern, Jones's simmering resentment. In most cases, law crumbles without evidence. Here, it crumbled under excessive theory, and every failure made the town more restless, more convinced that truth was just out of reach. I imagine Horton, weary and silent, watching testimony collapse like damp wood. Other officers looked outward, beyond Iowa, at a rash of axe murders across the Midwest between 1911 and 1930. In Colorado Springs, an entire family slain. In Ellsworth, Kansas, another. Doors locked, lamps extinguished, victims in bed. The similarities piled up like shadows cast by the same unseen figure. Some called it the work of a rail-riding phantom who disappeared with the whistle of the morning train. But linking crimes across states required proof of travel, timetables, eyewitnesses, and those pieces refused to hold together. Newspapers fanned the flames, naming the X-Men in broad strokes, as if one killer explained everything. Detectives drew maps along rail lines, their pins stretching across states like stitches in a body too large to mend. Yet when examined closely, the lines never touched firmly enough. Myth stepped in where maps failed. The confrontation extended beyond suspects. It was a confrontation with the limits of justice itself. Families wanted an answer. The courts needed evidence that would not dissolve under cross-examination. The press demanded drama, and each false lead fed its appetite. What emerged was not truth, but theater, with the house as its stage and the town as unwilling actors. I often think of the jury that listened to Kelly's trial, their faces drawn from weeks of testimony. They wanted him guilty. You can feel it in the transcripts. Yet the law demanded a higher burden. When acquittal came, relief and anger mingled in the courtroom like smoke. Justice had been followed, yet no justice was felt. That paradox is the essence of Villisca's story. In my notes, I keep a list of the ritual elements-covered mirrors, darkened lamps, washed hands, the strange placement of food. Each detail is small, but together they form a portrait of someone deliberate, someone rehearsed. That portrait does not look like a preacher or a businessman or a single drifter. It looks like a shadow cast across many lives, never fully seen. As the confrontation dragged on through trials, theories, and headlines, the case became heavier than the crime itself. Villisca was no longer just a town, it was a question. Who enters a house in the dead of night, waits in silence, and leaves 8 lives extinguished without waking a neighbor? Who creates ritual out of brutality? These questions refused to die, and so the story outlived the people who lived it. By the time the courts gave up, the murders had shifted into folklore. Children dared each other to run past the Moore house after dark. Reporters returned every anniversary, scribbling fresh stories on old bones. And police like me, decades later, could only walk through the silence and ask the same unanswered questions. The confrontation was never solved. It only shifted from the courtroom to history itself. The house itself became the final witness, silent and stubborn. For years it sat on that corner lot, painted white, windows staring, while townsfolk crossed the street to avoid its gaze. Children whispered about ghosts, but grown men lowered their voices too when the subject came up. It was easier to let the house carry the weight of suspicion than to admit no man had ever been held accountable. I've read through later reports, the ones compiled decades after the blood was scrubbed away. They speak of covered mirrors, extinguished lamps, cigarette butts in the attic, a slab of bacon left like an unfinished thought. They speak of footsteps heard by no one and timetables that never quite aligned. When you add it all up, what you have is less a solution than a ritual and act repeated across towns, carried out with a patience that mocks explanation. The case became a kind of inheritance. Each generation of officers inherited the same brittle folders, the same yellowed photographs, the same rumors written in ink and in whispers. Some swore Mansfield fit the pattern, others pinned it to Kelly, still others believed in a nameless phantom tied to the rails. The file was less an investigation than a mirror, reflecting whichever suspect a man most feared or distrusted. I sometimes imagine standing in the parlor that morning, Horton at my side, the whole house quiet except for the settling of wood. What would it have taken to preserve the truth before it was trampled? A rope across the door? A sheriff who held the crowd back with force? Instead, the scene was spoiled before it was studied, and from that ruin grew 100 competing stories. We are left chasing shadows because we allowed the light to be stolen. In the resolution, there is no verdict, only atmosphere. The townspeople returned to their routines, but the shadow lingered over supper tables and Sunday sermons. Newspapers drifted on to new crimes, but Villisca kept its old one, folded into its history like a scar under fabric. And the families who lost children learned to live not with justice, but with speculation. What keeps me awake is not the brutality, but the method. The coverings, the washings, the extinguished light, these are not the habits of frenzy, but of someone rehearsed. A stranger could do it once, perhaps, but to do it across states, across families, across time, suggests something larger. Was it one man? Or many, each imitating the last? The silence of the records leaves both doors open. If you walk the house today, you feel it immediately. The press of air, the creak of boards, the way every corner seems to hold its breath. It has become a museum now, a place where history and legend mingle. People claim to hear footsteps, to see curtains stir, to feel the cold of something unfinished. Whether you believe them or not, the atmosphere is undeniable, an echo of what was left unresolved. And so, the resolution is not closure, but confrontation with uncertainty. The Villisca Axe Murders stand as a testament to what happens when evidence dissolves and rumor grows unchecked. Every suspect tells a story, but none tell the whole one. The house remains white and watchful, a reminder that sometimes justice is not the ending, but the absence of one. The more I study the case, the more I realize resolution here was never about a name. It was about the town learning to live with not knowing, to fold uncertainty into its identity. Villisca became synonymous with the unsolved, its story repeated in classrooms, church basements, and whispered tours. Some call it tragedy, others curse, but all agree it never truly ended. Files tell me suspects moved on, their lives twisting in different directions. Frank Jones retired with his reputation forever shadowed by rumor, but never condemned by law. George Kelly drifted, preaching in smaller towns, his confession a stain he could never scrub away. Mansfield faced trials elsewhere, his name linked to axe killings, but never conclusively to Villisca. Each man carried suspicion like a second skin, and each escaped the noose. What remains are the patterns. Families struck after church nights. Lamps lowered until they barely breathed. Windows covered, mirrors turned away, faces hidden. A killer or killers who moved like ritual, who treated houses as stages and bodies as props. This consistency is the only fingerprint left, and even that refuses to point to just one hand. When I sit with the evidence, the open ending feels deliberate, as if the case itself chose ambiguity. It forces you to keep turning it over, seeing Jones in one light, Kelly in another, the faceless drifter in a third. Each theory fits until you lean too close, and then it slips away. That's why the murders still breathe in the collective imagination. They were designed, consciously or not, to resist closure. I think of the children most often because they anchor the case in humanity rather than mystery. Their routines were known: chores, school, laughter spilling across fences. On that Sunday, they recited lines in the church program, their voices proud, their futures unspoken. To see them silenced in the very beds meant to keep them safe is to understand why the town could never rest easy. The house, in its way, became the final character in this story. Locked that night, broken open the next morning, filled with strangers before the day was out. It held secrets in its walls, then became a canvas for every theory painted across its rooms. Even now, people walk its floors as though waiting for it to speak. But it never does. That silence is the ending. Not a verdict, not an arrest, not a neat explanation tied up with motive and means. Just silence, as heavy and permanent as the bloodstains once were. It leaves us asking whether the perpetrator was a neighbor, a rival, a drifter, or someone we never named at all. And perhaps that question matters more than the answer ever could. I leave my notes with the same conclusion Horton must have felt as he stepped back from the house that morning. Unfinished. 8 lives ended in ritual, a town forever marked, a case preserved not in justice, but in mystery. And the windows of that little white house still stare blankly, as if daring us to keep looking, daring us to wonder whose shadow moved inside.